On the night we got married, I hid beneath the bed, intending to surprise my husband. Instead, another woman walked in first and placed her phone on speaker. What she played made my heart freeze in terror. Have you ever felt the precise moment your soul shatters? Not into a million pieces like glass, but into a fine, choking dust that coats the inside of your lungs, making every subsequent breath a labor of sheer will? I felt that sensation lying on the abrasive, industrial-grade carpet of a luxury hotel suite, inhaling the scent of dust mites and expensive floor cleaner, while the man I had just promised to love, honor, and cherish plotted the exact date of my funeral with a woman I thought was his accountant. The idea to hide under the bed had been born from a naive, champagne-fueled burst of giddiness, a desire to start our marriage with laughter, to jump out and scare my stoic, serious husband, Elias, and watch his composure crack into a smile. I had kicked off my heels, the white satin stained with grass from the outdoor ceremony, and shimmied beneath the massive king-sized frame, the box spring pressing uncomfortably against my spine, giggling into my hand as I waited for the sound of his keycard. I expected him to walk in alone, perhaps loosening his tie, perhaps calling my name with that deep, resonant voice that had charmed me into submission over the last whirlwind year. Instead, the door clicked open 20 minutes later, and two pairs of footsteps entered, one heavy and familiar, the other the sharp, staccato click of stilettos that I didn't recognize. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, assuming it was housekeeping or perhaps a luggage porter, until the woman spoke, her voice devoid of the polite deference of staff, dripping instead with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. She didn't ask where to put the bags. She simply walked to the center of the room, stopping inches from where my face was pressed against the floor, and said that they needed to review the timeline before the honeymoon phase began in earnest. I lay there, paralyzed by confusion, staring at the toes of her red-soled shoes, waiting for Elias to dismiss her, to tell her that this was his wedding night and business could wait. But he didn't. He locked the door, the heavy deadbolt sliding home with a finality that echoed in the silence, and told her to play the recording to ensure there were no discrepancies in their story. That was the moment the game ended and the nightmare began. The moment the silence under the bed transformed from a hiding spot into a coffin. To understand how I ended up beneath that bed, you have to understand the man who put me there, or rather, the carefully constructed mirage of a man I had fallen in love with. Elias was the kind of person who felt like gravity. When he entered a room, the atmosphere shifted, pulling everyone into his orbit with a mixture of charisma and quiet intensity that I mistook for depth. We met in a coffee shop, a cliche that he exploited perfectly, commenting on the book I was reading, a dense, obscure history of Victorian architecture with a knowledge that seemed too specific to be feigned. I was 26, a junior archivist at the City Museum, used to being overlooked, used to fading into the background of my own life, and here was this older, sophisticated developer who looked at me as if I were a rare artifact he had just discovered. He courted me with an intensity that I now recognize as love bombing, a relentless barrage of attention, gifts, and grand gestures that dismantled my defenses before I even knew they were being attacked. He didn't just want to date me, he wanted to consume me. Within 3 months, he was talking about marriage. Within 6, he had convinced me to move out of the apartment I shared with my sister, Sarah, and into his sprawling, minimalist estate on the outskirts of the city. A house that was beautiful but felt cold, like living inside a sculpture rather than a home. Sarah, my innocent bystander in this tragedy, had warned me. She told me that he moved too fast, that his eyes didn't match his smile, that there was something hollow about the way he spoke about his past, which was a carefully curated sob story about a tragic widowerhood that garnered instant sympathy. I dismissed her concerns as jealousy, as the protectiveness of a big sister who didn't want to lose her roommate, and I allowed Elias to slowly, methodically isolate me from the only family I had. He did it with a smile, telling me that Sarah was toxic to our relationship, that we needed to focus on building our own foundation, and I, desperate to be loved, drank the poison and thanked him for it. The wedding planning was a blur of his preferences masking as ours. Elias insisted on a lavish ceremony, far beyond what I wanted or could afford, but he waved away my concerns with his black card, telling me that he wanted to give me the world. He controlled the guest list, the venue, the menu, all under the guise of wanting to alleviate my stress, but in reality, he was curating a stage for his performance. The only thing he insisted I handle personally was the life insurance policy. He brought it up one evening over dinner, framing it as a responsible step for a married couple, especially since he was bringing so many assets into the marriage. He suggested a policy for me that was staggering in its payout, millions of dollars that seemed absurd for an archivist, but he argued that if something happened to me, the loss of my income combined with the emotional devastation would destroy him, and he wanted to be safe. It sounded logical, it sounded protective, and because I trusted him implicitly, I signed the papers without reading the fine print, without noticing that the double indemnity clause for accidental death was highlighted in his copy. He had the policy expedited, ensuring it was active 48 hours before the ceremony, a detail that barely registered in the chaos of fittings and rehearsals, but which now looms as the smoking gun of his premeditation. I walked down the aisle toward him, feeling like the luckiest woman in the world, unaware that the man wiping a tear from his eye was not overcome with emotion, but with the anticipation of a payout. The wedding day itself was a sensory overload, a kaleidoscope of flashes, music, and forced smiles that left me feeling dissociated from my own body. I remember standing at the altar, looking into Elias's eyes as we recited our vows, and feeling a sudden, inexplicable chill when he promised to be with me until death do us part, his grip on my hands tightening just a fraction too much, bordering on painful. The reception was a grand affair held in the ballroom of the Skyline Hotel, filled with his business associates and vague friends I had barely met, people who looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and pity that I couldn't place. I drank more champagne than I usually would, trying to drown the nagging anxiety in my gut, trying to force myself into the role of the blushing bride. By the time we retreated to the bridal suite on the top floor, I was giddy with exhaustion and alcohol, needing to break the tension, which led to the fateful decision to hide. I wanted to see him laugh. I wanted to strip away the formality of the day and just be two people in love. So I crawled under the bed, the dust ruffles concealing me, and waited for my husband. When the door opened and the red-soled shoes walked in, followed by Elias, the air in the room changed instantly. It wasn't the intimacy of a honeymoon. It was the cold, transactional atmosphere of a boardroom meeting. The woman I recognized her voice now. It was Veronica. His financial advisor who had attended the wedding in a dress that was slightly too white didn't sit down. She paced. "Is it done?" she asked. "Did she sign the final addendum?" Elias chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth. "She signed it between the hair and makeup. She didn't even read it. She trusts me." That was when she placed her phone on the nightstand, directly above my head. I could hear the thud of the device against the wood. "I want you to hear the recording from the insurer," she said, "just to be sure we are clear on the timeline. If she dies before the honeymoon hike, it looks suspicious. It has to be the accident on the trail. Day 3. The cliff near the waterfall." My heart stopped. I mean that literally. For a second, my chest seized so violently I thought I had died right there. I pressed my hand over my mouth, tears instantly springing to my eyes as she tapped the screen. The recording that played wasn't an insurer. It was Elias. It was a recording of him speaking to Veronica weeks ago. "The drop is 300 feet, his voice said, clear and distorted by the speaker. "I'll say she slipped trying to take a selfie. It's tragic. It's believable. And with the double indemnity, it clears the debt on the development project and leaves us with 4 million liquid. She's clumsy, Veronica. Everyone knows it. I've been planting that seed for months." I lay there, listening to my husband discuss my murder with the casual tone one might use to discuss a dinner reservation. The clumsiness he had teased me about, the times he had saved me from tripping on the sidewalk, it was all a setup. He had been building a witness list for my death. The recording ended, and the silence in the room was suffocating. I could hear Elias pouring a drink, the clink of ice against glass sounding like gunshots. "Day 3, he repeated. "I'll take her up to the ridge. You make sure the transfer accounts are ready. Once the police rule it accidental, I want the money moved offshore within 24 hours. Veronica laughed, a low, throaty sound. "You're wicked, Elias. Does she have any idea?" "None," he replied. "She thinks I'm her Prince Charming. She's so desperate for love she'd jump off that cliff herself if I asked her to. It's almost too easy." The cruelty of his words stripped away the last layer of my denial. I wasn't a wife. I was a pig being fattened for slaughter. The love, the future, the family we had talked about, it was all just the overhead cost of doing business. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying they wouldn't check the room, praying I wouldn't sneeze or sob, my body trembling so hard the floor seemed to vibrate beneath me. I was trapped in a box of my own making, inches away from the monsters who had been feeding on my trust. They stayed in the room for another 10 minutes, discussing the logistics of my funeral closed casket, he insisted, to save on costs and avoid questions before deciding to go back down to the hotel bar to make an appearance for the guests who were staying overnight. "We have to look like the happy couple," Elias said. "I'll go down first. You wait 5 minutes and leave through the service elevator." When the door finally clicked shut behind Elias, and then 5 minutes later behind Veronica, I didn't move for a long time. I couldn't. My limbs felt like lead, my brain firing signals that were getting lost in the static of my terror. Eventually, the survival instinct kicked in. I crawled out from under the bed, my wedding dress gray with dust, my face streaked with tears and mascara. I looked at the room, the rose petals on the bed, the champagne on ice, and saw it for what it was, a crime scene waiting to happen. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't change my clothes. I grabbed my purse, kicked off my shoes so I could run silently, and fled the room, moving like a ghost through the hallway, terrified that the elevator doors would open and reveal him standing there. I didn't go to the lobby. I knew he was at the bar, watching the exits. I took the service stairs, running down 20 flights in my stocking feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't call the police immediately. I didn't trust that they would believe me without proof, and I was terrified Elias had friends on the force, a paranoia born of his constant bragging about his connections. Instead, I ran to the hotel's security office in the basement, bursting in on a startled night manager, a man named Mr. Henderson. I must have looked insane, a bride in a ruined dress, hyperventilating, rambling about murder plots and insurance fraud. But Mr. Henderson didn't dismiss me. He looked at the terror in my eyes. He looked at the bruising on my arm where I had banged it crawling out, and he listened. He locked the office door, pulled up the security feed of the hallway to confirm Veronica's presence, and then he called a contact he had in the Major Crimes Division, bypassing the patrol officers. "Sit down, ma'am," he told me, handing me his jacket to cover my shaking shoulders. "You're safe here. Nobody comes in unless I buzz them in." The detectives arrived an hour later, entering through the loading dock to avoid suspicion. I told them everything: the insurance policy, the recording, the conversation, the specific details of the hiking accident. They were skeptical at first, until I mentioned Veronica. One of the detectives recognized the name. She was a known associate of a man they had been investigating for insurance fraud involving commercial fires. The connection gave my story the weight it needed. They set up a sting. They wanted me to go back to the room, to pretend I knew nothing, to wear a wire. I refused. I couldn't look at him again without screaming, so they went to plan B. They went up to the suite, where Elias had returned, likely wondering where his bride was. They found him destroying the SIM card from Veronica's phone. He must have gotten paranoid paranoid when I wasn't there. They arrested him not for murder, but for fraud and conspiracy, using the leverage of Veronica's history to get a warrant for his devices. The unraveling of Elias's life was swift and horrifying. It turned out I wasn't the first. I was just the first to survive. His tragic widower story was half true. His first wife had died in a boating accident 5 years ago, an accident that had paid out $2 million and was never fully investigated because her body was never found. The police reopened that case immediately. They found emails between him and Veronica dating back years, outlining schemes to defraud investors, banks, and women. I spent the next year of my life not as a newlywed but as a star witness. I sat in a courtroom and watched the man I loved stare at me with dead, shark-like eyes, no longer masking his contempt. I listened to the audio forensics experts enhance the recording I had heard under the bed, playing it for a jury that looked at him with pure revulsion. The defense tried to paint me as a gold digger who got cold feet, but the double indemnity clause was a damning piece of paper that no lawyer could explain away. Elias was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and later, thanks to new evidence, the murder of his first wife. He was sentenced to life without parole. I stood in the back of the courtroom when the sentence was read, feeling a strange hollowness. There was no joy, only the immense relief of gravity returning to the room. I annulled the marriage, changed my name, and moved to a small town by the ocean, far away from cliffs and waterfalls. It took years to stop checking under my own bed before I went to sleep, years to trust the sound of a key in a lock, but I survived. I am no longer the girl who hides. I am the woman who listens. And I know now that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones under the bed, they are the ones who invite you into it. I write this now as a warning to anyone who thinks love should be a whirlwind. If it feels too perfect, if it moves too fast, if they isolate you from the people who know you best, listen to the silence. Listen to the things they don't say. And never, ever let someone else write your life insurance policy. Thanks for watching my story. If you've ever survived a relationship that wasn't what it seemed, or if you have a story about trusting your gut, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of survival.